Hi, my name is Nate, and welcome to In a Car. Finger skateboards have been a novelty since the 1960s. They were originally keychains. In 1985, there was a segment in a skate video that featured fingerboards. It inspired a lot of similar segments in other videos throughout the 1980s. In 1987, Somerville International mass-produced the first non-keychain fingerboards. They collaborated with a lot of brands, both skate-related and not skate-related. They also made a really unfortunately named line called Finger Boy and Finger Girl. In the 90s, Buckle Down Products made the first fingerboard ramps. Then a brand called Berserk started making them as well, and they had a website called TechDeck.com. Then some lawsuits happened behind closed doors. In 1999, a company called X Concept started selling fingerboards under the name TechDeck. That company was eventually acquired by Spin Master. They would collaborate with skate brands that had a Beanie Baby-like market strategy, make one available in limited numbers for limited time. They hit their peak in 2006 with the popularization of internet videos. In 1891, a meat processing company called Hormel started. In the 20s and 30s, canned foods started to gain traction, but there weren't any canned meats. They started making canned meats. In 1926, they introduced Hormel hams to butcher shops. With some minor tweaks to the recipe as well as advancements in canning technologies, Spam was created. In 1937, it began being sold in grocery stores and instantly became popular. The name is a portmanteau for spiced ham. By 1940, 70% of Americans were buying Spam, but what really cemented its place in history was World War II. Spam was given to soldiers for a lot of reasons, but mainly because it was cheap and had a long shelf life. And in many cases, where Spam went, it got adopted into the local diet. This is even true for a lot of Japanese families that were in US internment camps. There's even a Monty Python bit where they say the name over and over, and that's where the term Spam mail comes from. In its over 80 years, Spam hasn't really changed that much. Up, up, down, down, left, right, BA. In 1985, Kazuhisa Mashimoto was working on a home version of the arcade game Gradius for Konami. But he wasn't really that good at the game, so he made this easy-to-remember code that he could use to make the game easier to beat and test for bugs. Whether it was an accident or intentional, it was left in the final game. But it wasn't really well known at first. Other Konami developers would put it in their game as well. What the code did would vary from game to game. In 1988, the code was included in the home version of Contra, which is a very difficult game. The code became public knowledge when the first issue of Nintendo Power came out in 1988, where they wrote about it. It's now super famous and appears in a lot of non-Konami games too. Sometimes it doesn't even do anything, or it'll scold you for trying to cheat. My favorite video game cheat is explosive punches in GTA 4. What's yours? In 1992, Hiroji Kiyotake designed a new antagonist for Mario for Super Mario Land 2 for the Game Boy. The character's name was a combination of Mario and the Japanese word for bad. Wario was designed to be the Bluto to Mario's Popeye. He had a huskier build, and Mario's M was flipped to a W. It's also speculated that the design was inspired by Spike from Wrecking Crew. Super Mario Land 2 was received well, and Wario made a reappearance in Wario Land, Super Mario Land 3. Wario has appeared in other media and multiple games. The first game to give Wario a voice was Mario Kart 64, and it's thought that he was originally planned to be German. In the Japanese version of the game, Wario's dialogue is in German, but in all other versions, he's voiced by Charles Martinet, the voice of Mario, and is Italian. In 2000, Mario Tennis released for the N64. During development, it was realized that while most characters had a partner for doubles, Wario didn't. Fumihide Akoi, however, changed that by creating Waluigi. Much like Wario, Waluigi was designed to be a foil to Luigi. Also like Wario, his name is a portmanteau for the word bad in Japanese and Luigi. And also like Wario, it's thought that his design is inspired by Spike from Wrecking Crew. During his design, there was also thoughts of a foil to Peach being made, but the idea never made it past conception. Also, it's always bugged me that the L on his hat is mirrored rather than flipped. There are a lot of official sources that say that Waluigi and Wario are brothers, but there also seem to be a lot of official sources that say otherwise. To many fans, Waluigi is yet to hit the spotlight, but fingers crossed that will change soon. On November 14th of 2004, the SpongeBob SquarePants movie released. On November 11th of that same year, Burger King started an advertisement campaign for SpongeBob's movie. In addition to having their usual Burger King toys, they also had 9-foot-tall SpongeBob inflatables that they placed on the top of their restaurants. And eventually, people did what I would have done too, and stole them. It was even happening so frequently that Burger King put out a statement saying that anybody who brought back one of the inflatables would get free Whoppers for a full year. If you have $500, you can even get this one from some guy who claims to have bought it legally. This one's brief, but interesting all the same. In 1983, at Carnegie Mellon University, Professor Scott Fahlman felt like jokes that he had been making on the computer's bulletin board weren't being understood as jokes. So he came up with a smiley face icon to put on his jokes to indicate which posts were serious. Quickly it began being used in message boards, and it spread really quickly, and more faces were added to the lexicon. Emoticon is a contraction between emotion and icon. It was first used in a New York Times article in 1990. I couldn't find any documentation about when the nose started to get dropped. I'll do another video about Japanese emoticons as well as emojis. Little side note here. There is what can be considered a smiley face in a poem by Robert Herrick from 1648, and a winky face in a transcript from the New York Times of one of Lincoln's speeches. But there's debate as to whether they're intentional. There's also a magazine from the 1880s that has typographical art in it. No matter what, they didn't gain cultural relevance until the 1980s. In 1983, 6 businessmen from Florida started Hooters, kind of as a joke. It was incorporated on April Fool's Day, and they thought it would fail. But the next year, it was bought by a group led by Bob Brooks. Throughout the 80s and 90s, it was really successful, but in the early 2000s, they made some really weird choices. In 2003, Bob Baker purchased a small charter airline, and then started Hooters Air. Based out of Myrtle Beach, North Carolina, flights were a flat rate of $129. Each flight would have actual attendants that would serve food and drinks, as well as 2 Hooters girls that would do some kind of entertainment. By some accounts, the Hooters girls did trivia in the last 5 minutes of the flight. Unfortunately for them, the timing was terrible because fuel prices were very expensive and 9/11 anxiety was still very much a thing. In 2006, they were forced to shut it down. One day while gardening, Shigeru Miyamoto noticed a line of ants carrying a leaf. He thought to himself, what if those were people? Miyamoto wanted to make a game where a bunch of creatures worked together to do something. The GameCube released in 2001. Pikman released in 2001 and was a success, so a sequel was in order. A sequel was confirmed in 2002 in a Japanese Playboy interview with Shigeru Miyamoto. In 2004, Pikmin 2 was released and Olimar was joined by Louie. Some tweaks were made from the first game and it was a success. But it didn't quite hit the sales of the first game. There were talks of a Pikmin game for the Game Boy Advance, but Miyamoto shut it down. Those games were re-released in 2009 with motion controls for the Wii. But for some reason, the re-release of Pikmin 2 didn't hit America until 2012. Pikmin 3 released in 2013 and featured 3 new protagonists. It did pretty well like the other games. Hey Pikmin released in 2017 for the 3DS. In October of 2020, Pikmin 3 Deluxe was released for the Switch. And since at least 2015, Pikmin 4 has been in development. Robert Indiana was born as Robert Clark in Indiana. He had a very extensive career in the arts, even collaborating with Andy Warhol. In the 60s is when some of his most famous pieces were made. In 1965, the original Love image was made for a Christmas card for the Museum of Modern Art. The image was adopted by many countercultural movements. In 1970, the first Love sculpture was made for the Indianapolis Museum of Art. And since there have been several more made that are in various locations and languages. In the 30s, Kevin Bacon's dad designed the park that would become Love Park in Philadelphia. In the 60s, it opened as JFK Plaza. In 1976, Robert Indiana lent one of his Love sculptures to Philadelphia for their bicentennial celebration. It was removed in 1978, but it became such a cultural landmark that eventually it was bought and has a permanent residence in Philadelphia. Why are there no Kinder Surprise eggs in the US? In the 1930s, a pharmaceutical company tried to make a liquid form of an antibiotic. Unfortunately, despite there being sufficient evidence that the added chemicals were toxic to humans, it was overlooked. Hundreds of kids died as a result. Because of that, the US implemented some new laws in an attempt to prevent it in the future. In one of the clauses, it forbids food from having any non-edible thing in it that isn't essential to the function. So a stick on a candy apple would be perfectly fine. Because of that, despite numerous efforts to change it, that's why Kinder eggs are illegal, because of the toy inside. So us in the US are stuck with Kinder Joy. With all the recent talk of Nintendo being unfair, I thought this would be a fun one. In 1989, a 9-year-old named Clark Thiemann bought a copy of LGN Major League Baseball for his NES. It was the first game to have a license to use MLB team names, but they didn't have a license to use player names. Players were labeled by the number on their uniform, and by 1989, the roster was out of date. Clark and his dad went to return the game, but because the seal was broken on it, they wouldn't get a refund. His dad, Nick Thiemann, tried to write to Nintendo of America, but they never responded. But he was a lawyer, so they sued Nintendo, LJN, and the MLB. And it was a class action, so anybody else who bought the game and didn't like it could hop in. They argued that the package's promise to simulate managerial duties couldn't be fulfilled without player names. They wanted the game to either stop being sold or just change the packaging to something less deceiving. Ultimately, the case was dismissed and Nintendo won. In the 30s, Robert May was an advertising copywriter for Montgomery Ward. One day, his boss asked him to make something that they could give away for Christmas. May came up with the story of Rudolf the Red-Nosed Reindeer. But red noses were associated with alcoholism, so the idea got rejected. But May still hired an artist to make a cutesy red-nosed reindeer. He showed it to his bosses again, and this time they liked it. Millions of books were given away by Montgomery Ward. 10 years later, his brother-in-law Johnny Marks wrote the song Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer, and that's what propelled Rudolph to mainstream success. Montgomery Ward even transferred all the rights to Rudolph to May and his family. And 15 years after that, the Rankin and Bass Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer movie was made, and Rudolph is now cemented as a Christmas icon. I'm going to focus on the first game because the whole series is way too much for 1 minute. At 21, Hironobu Sakaguchi dropped out of college. In 1986, he started working full-time at Square. But after multiple games that he worked on didn't become commercially successful and Square was on the verge of bankruptcy, he decided to just make one more game. He would give it one last shot, and if it didn't work, he'd go back to school. The game, Final Fantasy, hit the market in Japan in 1987 and was a huge success. It pretty much saved Square, and they started development on the second game right away. In 1990, the first game finally hit the US. Despite several other RPGs having a head start in America, it quickly won the battle and started the Final Fantasy empire that we know today. In the 90s, Air Jordans were really popular. An advertiser that shared a love of Michael Jordan and cartoons wanted to combine the two. So 2 Air Jordan ads were made featuring Michael Jordan and Bugs Bunny, aired in 1992 and 1993. The success of those commercials led to a movie being approved. But the project was closed in 1993 because Michael Jordan decided to retire from basketball. After a brief stint playing baseball, Michael Jordan returned to basketball in 1995 and the project was resumed. Production was rough, and they had a hard time finding actors that wanted to be involved with the project. At some point, they even looked at more people who had more acting experience than Michael Jordan to replace him. All the same, Space Jam was made, and they even made a huge pop-up basketball court / green room for Michael Jordan. The movie serves as a fictional version of what Michael Jordan was doing during his break at the NBA. In 2021, there's going to be a new Space Jam movie. Have you ever heard of Saturnalia? In ancient Rome, there was a festival that fluctuated in length. Sometimes it was a day long, sometimes it was a week long. During that time, they would honor Saturn and no one was allowed to conduct any business. They'd also exchange gifts and just get downright wild. And most famously, masters would have to serve their slaves. To learn more about Saturnalia and how it relates to Christmas, please check out my full video on YouTube, and the link is on my page. Vikings are a far from rare thing in our popular culture, so it's probably no surprise to you to hear that facial hair was really important to them. In the 1400s, there was a written piece called Njaal's Saga. It takes place around this time period, and it tells the danger of seeking revenge. In that story, Njaal is mentioned several times to not have a beard, and his sons are even called dung beardlings. Beards are so tied to masculinity that because their father couldn't grow a beard, it was rumored that the sons had to spread poop on their face to mimic beards. Or that the sons were entirely made of poop because their father was not masculine enough to be fertile. Viking men loved their beards. Alright, we can do that. In 1983, a show that was unmistakably made by Jim Henson debuted after several Muppet hits were released. Fraggle Rock, however, was the first HBO original program, and it was developed for international audiences, which was really uncommon at the time. It was even the first American show to be broadcasted in the Soviet Union. In early versions of the script, the Fraggles were named the Woozles, but they were changed to something that sounded less British. There are also creatures in Winnie the Pooh called the Woozles. In different places that it aired throughout the world, the human characters were different. It aired for 5 seasons, and in 2020, Apple ordered a new reboot of the series. My name is Nate, and welcome to In a Car. Why is Christmas celebrated on December 25th? Well, in some places it's actually celebrated in January. But there are 2 leading theories as to why it's celebrated on December 25th. The first is that Christians took over existing ancient holidays and rebranded them as Christmas. The second is that they used crazy math to figure out when Jesus was born, because it doesn't say when in the Bible. If you want to learn more about this and ancient Roman Christmas, please check out my full-length video on YouTube, linked in my page. Is secular culture trying to take the Christ out of Christmas? Nope. The New Testament was originally written in Greek. In Greek, the name Christ is written like this, and it starts with an X. Eventually, it even got shortened to this XP symbol. The story goes that in the 4th century, Roman Emperor Constantine had a vision and then made this symbol. Regardless of its origins, however, parchment paper was not cheap. so they would shorten Christ to XP to save space and more paper. By 1021, we see written evidence of Christmas being spelled out as Xpmas. And since at least the 1800s, it's been seen as Xmas. So no, Christ is not being taken out of Christmas. A small typo in the Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer special in 1964 almost led to Rudolph being in the public domain. Well, that's what most people would have you think, but not quite. In the opening of the Rudolph special, you see the year that it was copyrighted. However, it was written in Roman numerals, and it was incorrect Roman numerals. Instead of reading as 1964, it accidentally says 1164. And in the copyright laws at that time, you had to prominently display the year that it was copyrighted. And that law was later amended in 1978, but still that wouldn't have affected works from before that. So while in most cases that would make the work public domain, that's not the case for Rudolph. Like I said in this video here, Montgomery Ward gave the rights back to the creator of Rudolph, who was their employee. So despite that typo making the copyright seem null and void, you'd still have to get permission from Robert May to use Rudolph. Sure. Josef Albers was born in Germany in
1888.
For a few years he worked as a teacher, then an art teacher, and then learned to make stained glass. In 1920 he began to study at the Bauhaus. During his time there, he created some of his most famous works, and he began to develop and explore abstract geometric patterns in his art, as well as color theory. In 1933, the Bauhaus was shut down due to the rise of the Nazi regime in Germany. And during that time, Josef emigrated from Germany to the US. When he came to the US, he began working at the Black Mountain College in North Carolina. He taught there until 1949, where he then became the chairman of the art department at Yale. He retired from teaching in 1958, where he spent the rest of his life focusing on creating art, working on commissioned pieces and exhibits. He made these album covers. He continued to make art until his death in 1976.